of interest to me. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I am Jeffrey Tamburo. Many of you know me. I've been had the pleasure of working with Best Buddies Jobs for several years now, in person at times, and mainly virtually. I'm an extension associate here as well at the Yang Tan Institute at Cornell. I always like to share that for 17 of my working career years, I was an employment service professional. I've been a job coach. I've been a job developer. I was director of employment for an organization here in Syracuse, New York, where I live. And so much of what I talk about in general, when I meet with folks like you, is based upon some of my own experiences from working in the field, the good, the bad, and the not so good, of mistakes I've made and things hopefully I've learned along the way, as well as meeting with all of you and employment professionals as a trainer for really the past 15 years now. So that's kind of a little bit about who I am. And I hope Adina and I had a lot of fun working with your leadership and kind of pulling together some things. We really crafted this session with you in mind. So there'll be times we'll ask you to interact and times just, to listen and reflect and, questions, comments, thoughts. We love engagement. Those that know Adina and I know that. Throw them in the chat, or I think you can, just talk as well if you'd like. So now I always have, you got to give me a minute here. Okay. The first thing we're going to do, and I have a PowerPoint embedded here, so I click through these. The first thing, okay, there we go. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do, and you don't have to say anything right now, but I want you, we're talking about assessment, getting to know people. And so I thought it would be fun to take all of you through a personality test. And we actually call this the PIG Profile Personality Test. I hadn't done it in a while. I used to do it in person all the time. And so just ask you all you need in front of you, you don't have to show anybody, is a piece of paper and a pen, because I'm going to ask you to kind of draw something. So you're going to take this personality test, right? It should take maybe 3 minutes. This is not anything all that big and scientific, right? Like I said, you'll need a blank sheet of paper and something to write with. So I'll just give you a second to do that. I'm obviously not going to know if you're doing it, but you'll get the most out of this and have the most fun if you do follow the instructions that I'm about to go through. So take a second and do that. All right. So here are the thing. Oh, and the other thing I want to say is you don't have to share your results, right? Obviously, we're not together, so, it's not going to be that easy to share your results anyway. When I do it in person, people sometimes will hold up their drawing. So on your paper, I want you to draw, and I'll give you a minute to do this, draw a picture of a pig, like whatever you think a pig looks like. The beauty for me is that I am the world's worst artist, so I don't have to show anybody anything today. So take your time, but I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Draw a pig. And this is really important for you to kind of assess, for us to go through the next steps and assess personality. So draw a pig, and I'll give you a minute to do that. Hey, Dean, we need like Jeopardy music or classical music or jazz.
Totally do, yeah.
I don't know. Can you sing?
No.
Oh.
That's as close as you're getting.
I've seen your husband sing karaoke. He does pretty good. That's a whole other conversation.
We're not genetically related, thankfully,
I know.
so that doesn't pass on by osmosis.
Okay. All right, we'll give you a minute to do that. Draw a pig. That's it. No other guide or instructions. And we do have, this training is for 2 hours. So for those of us on the East Coast, it goes till 2 o'clock, and you do the math from there, going back. I was actually just on the West Coast. Anyone here in Oregon? I was in the state of Oregon most of last week, doing some training with their VR, ODHS. Just getting back to my normal groove with the time zone.
Unfortunately, we don't have jobs in Oregon
I
yet.
wasn't
It's
sure.
on the horizon. We got some employer partners that are interested, but we're
Yeah.
working on our expansion towards Oregon.
Yeah, I didn't think so, Chris, because I've never heard Oregon mentioned, but you
We
got
have
a lot of
other-
folks.
Yeah, we have our expansion programs and our friendship there. They host events, just not our jobs program, but we do have Seattle, which is fairly close.
Yeah, it is. I don't think we drew people in from Washington, but yeah, their VR is really, doing a great job trying to involve providers in their community and training. So anyway, another conversation for another day. So, all right, I'm going to move forward. So I asked you to draw a pig. And so let's now take a minute. This is why I wanted you to make sure you drew it, because we're going to interpret your results of what you just drew. Okay. So, if the pig that you drew on your paper is towards the top, there's an image here of a pig on top of the paper, you are perceived as a positive and optimistic person. Positive and optimistic if your pig is at the top. All right. Maybe some of your pig is sort of in the middle of the page. So if your pig is drawn in the middle of the page, you are perceived as a realist. All right, and now there's a picture of a pig at the bottom of the page. So if your pig is drawn toward the bottom of your page, you are perceived as a rather pessimistic person, and you have a tendency to behave negatively under pressure. Okay, let's talk about the direction your pig is facing now. If your pig is facing to the left, you believe in things like tradition, you're friendly, and you have a tendency to remember dates and birthdays. That's if your pig is facing left. If your pig is facing forward, so there's a pig here looking right at us, right? Toward you, you are a very direct person. You neither fear nor avoid discussion, and you're the type of person that enjoys stirring the pot, so to speak, to promote change. Maybe that means you're a good advocate. All right. So if your pig is facing to the right, as this pig is doing on the slide now, you are innovative, you're creative, you're active. But you also have a poor memory for dates and birthdays, unlike the people whose pig was facing left. If your pig is drawn, some people are real artists, unlike me. If your pig is drawn with many details, there's a pig here that's very elaborate, you see yourself as a person who's analytical and cautious, and others need to work hard to earn your trust and to keep it. For some of us, like me, if your pig is drawn with few details, you are a risk taker. You wear your emotions on your sleeve and you care little for the details in life. You're a big picture thinker. If your pig has 4 legs showing, you're secure, you stick to your beliefs, and have been told at least once in your life that you're a pretty stubborn person. That's if you have 4 legs on your pig. If you have fewer than 4 legs showing on your pig, you're living through a period of major change. If your pig has ears, you're a better listener. And last but not least, the longer the pig's tail that you've drawn, including the loop, see how there's curlicue on this pig's tail, the more satisfied you are with the quality of your personal relationships. So, I want to ask you a question. What do you think about, how did your results turn out for you? What did you think? Were your results accurate? Were they not accurate? Were they a mix? Type anything in. How do you feel your results were as a result? We're interpreting your personality here.
Oh, very accurate, pretty spot on. Somebody put a picture of their pig. Pam, I love
Oh,
what a
who is
cute
that? Wait,
little
these are,
pig.
they're jumping. You're probably jumping. Or Pam, that's very sweet.
I think you're in the wrong profession. I think you need to be in like the cartooning industry.
You know, Pam, there's a little download. I could download this right now. Oh my gosh.
Oh, and here's the person that falls between the lines, like on a lot of personality tests. What if your pig is facing diagonally?
Well, I don't know. That wasn't measured in our test, right? Sometimes things like that will come up, or someone will say there's no tail. What does that mean? I've heard that. And Audrey, you know, you said this to everybody, you feel defensive, you know, sometimes that is the result that we get. You know, I don't know if you're being tongue in cheek or, you know, straight on this, but regardless, sometimes that is the reaction we'll get, you know, when people go through this test.
Someone says we're not losing Pam. Pam, don't go to cartooning unless it's on the side.
Let's see, Matthew, I think I'm optimistic, but my pig is in the center, dancing. You a dancer.
Uh,
Okay, did I miss any? Looks like a lot of people say spot on, accurate. Okay, so what I want to say here is, before I move forward, I'm trying to see what I have next here, is, you know, if you believe anything that I just said to you just now, I have a bridge to sell you, right? And so what I mean is, you know, and maybe I'll ask you, what's the purpose of this exercise? Hopefully you got, you know, maybe we got it. We had a little fun. It was a nice icebreaker. That was great. You guys are a lot of fun with this. But is there anything else you think we might learn from the pig profile? I actually talked for a while. Adina and I have been really busy and emailing a lot the past few weeks, and talked about, because I hadn't done this in a while. And I thought, you know, I think it's time to resurrect the pig activity when we go in and talk about assessment. What do you think? I love, you know, for those that know me, you know, and Nadine, we love for you to reflect. So what do you think the point might be of this?
Heather's reflected on it and said it's perception, and sometimes we can be universal. So depending how we look at things can be how we're perceived by others.
I'm not laughing at you, Heather. I'm laughing at Kathy's next comment. But yeah, well, I mean, there's no wrong answer here. You know, perception is so important, and this is going to be one of our themes, kind of as we go through our conversation with you today. Absolutely. There are a lot of ways to draw a pig. There are a lot of messages there, Kathy. I think if you do it with a participant, they may comment on the results. You may learn more. Well, you know, that is another interesting point, Pam. I hadn't actually thought of that in my little notes here in my head, you know, that it could be a great activity, an icebreaker with people that you work with as well. Absolutely. So, you know, let's kind of debrief a minute here, right? And just think about what you might have learned, right? So, oh shoot, why do slides jump? There we go. Back to there. So, you know, it says here a small amount of assessment, like we just did, could I think this keeps jumping. There we go. I think I know why. When you hit the space bar with your shirt, slides advance. So a small amount of assessment may provide us with an inaccurate picture. So think about this pig profile that we did. It took a very small piece of information, and then it really inferred all these kind of grand assumptions about your personality, right? And so, you know, I think for me, you know, one of the cautions with assessment is that we can, you know, and why assessment really does need to be kind of a deep, rich process is because it takes time to get to know people, and taking a small piece of information that maybe we read in someone's report, or maybe someone told us something, you know, about someone, and, you know, drawing all these sweeping conclusions is dangerous, right? So consider, for example, that maybe you have someone with a very high IQ. Does that mean that individual will be a great success? Or does an average IQ predict average success, right? And also think about with this activity, this, you know, we get, you know, so here I come from Cornell University, you know, and this may happen with documentation we receive from, you know, professionals in our field with degrees, and we get these reports, and, you know, it's pretty easy to believe, well, if I'm getting this with someone with a degree, with some expertise, there's got to be some validity to this. And the reality is that we always have to interpret information that we received on someone, particularly past information, take it with a grain of salt because people change, right? And, the example I just gave of the IQ, right? Someone with a higher IQ versus someone with an average IQ. Is that a predictor of success? What does that really tell us? And I'll give you a case in point. So there's I always trying to get better at describing the slides. I don't ever want to assume everybody sees them. So there's a slide up here and there's a picture of Andy Warhol. And there's a picture of whom I'll talk about in a minute, William James Sidis. So Andy Warhol, as probably folks here know, was an American painter, printmaker, filmmaker, and a leading figure in the visual art movement known as pop art. Yet he actually had a low average IQ of 86. And we know how accomplished in his venue in the arts Andy Warhol was. Now, alternatively, William James Sidis, who you probably maybe not have heard of, was really, from an IQ perspective, beyond brilliant. He had an IQ of between 250 and 300. And I forget, what's an average IQ, AD, these days? I don't remember, but it's certainly way lower than that. 100?
Yeah, like it's
something?
more like what is it, 110, 120?
Yeah, I think that's about
Yeah.
right, And so 250 compared to the average of one, just do the math, right? And so he is thought, William, is thought to be the smartest man to ever live. James, however, only took work. This is what he did. He ran adding machines or other, what we might call fairly menial tasks. And he really didn't make any huge contributions to mathematics, despite his brilliant IQ, right? So it's a pretty amazing Google search if you want to search it, right? So just remembering here, and there's a picture of a kind of an old school desktop computer here, but one or two assessment tools aren't going to provide you with everything you need. However, you don't want to use every tool you have to assess for everything possible, but maybe, I always say in our toolkit, and I know it's an overused metaphor, but in our toolkit as assessors and even as job developers or whatever, job coaches, we need to have a number of tools at our disposal, right? When it comes to assessment, we want to assess for questions, what we want to know about an individual. Assessment should only be conducted, and the whole point of assessment is to answer questions about an individual based upon what we're trying to get to learn about their job interests. So there's a cartoon here, and there's a man sitting at a desk, and there's different animals like a seal and a elephant, and a monkey, and a penguin, and I don't know what else, a goldfish, a fish, and some animal on the end that might be a dog. And so the man at the desk who's assessing them is saying, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Now, interpreting assessment information accurately is really imperative to assigning the appropriate meaning to all the data you've collected. We get all this information and we have to kind of make sense of it. So ask yourself if the assessment you're doing is going to answer the question you might have about an individual. And is this the best method to assess someone? So for example, if we're trying to ascertain someone's, I'll get to that, someone's job goal, maybe they have a particular job interest and we're trying to ascertain if, that would be, they have the skills, the abilities, capacities, what kind of assessment might we do? Might we do just some paper and pen online inventories? Might we just ask people questions? That will give us some information. Might we, this is one of my common themes when I always talk about assessment, assess and look at people and discover people in different environments, because, the reality is we all behave differently in different environments. So using the pig profile as an example, just think about, is there any connection between how we draw and our personality? So I think, there's nothing that I've heard of. And I certainly wouldn't want to depend on that in making my decisions about another person. And so just some things to keep in mind. So there's a bunch of pictures up here, right, of Britney Spears at different times throughout her life. I am no expert on Britney Spears. You probably know more about her than I do. But, we just want to, and you'll notice there's cute young Britney Spears. There's sort of the edgy older Britney Spears. There's one where, I don't know, what is she doing? Smashing windows. There's Britney Spears, the mom. Okay. We want to be, Britney Spears, like many of us, has depending on when you look at her, and her life has gone through phases, right? And changes. And so beware of how the old assessment information that you receive, how we interpret it. People change through time, due to their environment, just through general growth and maturity and experience. And we may get information, you know, from our funding source or from others in our referral packet that might be a year old, 5 years old, even 10 years old, right? And so, you know, assessment's an interesting thing, and we always want to keep an open mind going into it about the individual, especially when the information we have is outdated. I'm going to pause there, Aideen. Is there anything in the chat or anything we want to?
Just some Andrew commenting about what if I drew bacon, which made me chuckle. But then we use this image for our local virtual training on self-advocacy. So no other questions or anything in the chat.
You used the Britney Spears image, or
No,
bet
it was
you're
before
meaning
that. I think it was the cartoon, maybe.
the cartoon. I was going to say the Britney Spears one would be interesting on self-advocacy. So yeah, it's a great image, right? Because everyone brings some other talent, something else to the table, all the different folks, right? So Aideen, we're gonna talk a minute about how you're using assessment in your role, in your job, kind of getting the lay of the land. But go ahead, Aideen.
Yeah, Jeffrey and I, as we were talking about this and getting ready for this presentation, we were just thinking about the different ways that we've heard the term assessment used depending on the context that we've worked in and the purposes of how it's being done. And so one of the things you're going to hear us talk about today is that sometimes the language is confusing because it makes it sound like there's one type of assessment, and the assessment is like a one-time thing at one point in time. And it's actually a process, but the term assessment is used in a lot of different fields and can take on different meanings. But for the purpose of this question, we want to hear more about the context of how you all use it within Best Buddies, so that Jeffrey and I, as we're going through this this training together, we can be cognizant of, you know, what do you consider that falls within in your job that you would consider a type of assessment, recognizing that it might just be one piece of the puzzle. And it's not necessarily, you know, maybe it's not the assessment that determines whether somebody is in the program or not in the program, or ultimately is one of the like high stakes assessments that you might hear people talk about. But my guess is in some way you're doing something that has an assessment component. So just want to open that up for conversation. In what ways do you see yourself using assessment in the work that you do at Best Buddies? And, you know, you can answer any of these, like what kind of data or information do you gather? Assessment is usually about gathering information, and are there challenges? So this will kind of help us to you know, figure out what to touch on in this conversation, but also may give us some things to think about talking about in more depth in future trainings that we do with you or office hours. So I'm going to leave it open and let you all either unmute or put in the chat if you want to tell us, how are you using assessment?
I typed it in too for your visual learners. What does assessment look like for you? That was a general way to word it.
Well, in general, Best Buddies does have what we call a functional assessment,
Right.
where we kind of get to know the person, a little bit about their background, some of their likes and interests and things like that. And so we definitely use that as a start of a platform. But I think as we continue to have our meetings with our participants, we're constantly assessing. There's times where we have challenges where we have parents that do all the talking for our participants. So just being brave enough to ask, hey, can we have this meeting alone, or you go into another room for a minute and explain why we're doing it. Because sometimes it's, I want to see how well they can communicate with me and others that they're not used to talking with. So that way I can see how I can better support them in a job and what kind of job that they would be good at and be successful at. And then always looking at what our VR sends us, always looking at those. So I think just a combination of all of that and continuing that communication while we're having our meetings is the way that we can. So I feel like our assessment is always ongoing. It's short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, like Jeffrey talked about with Britney Spears, we're evolving and you're looking at something through one lens at one point in time. One of the things I can really relate to is that idea that you're always, as you're gathering information, sometimes you're getting a lot of information. Sometimes the information is most accurate when it's provided by somebody themselves. And so sometimes there's the tendency for family members to kind of not realize how they're inserting their own observations or biases and answering for, their loved one. But on the flip side, I will tell you that one of the things they tell you in assessing for things like ADHD is that a characteristic of ADHD is that people underestimate some of the challenges they have, and sometimes people will not accurately see how they're coming across to others. So there's times when you want to bring in somebody else's perspective, and there's times when you might need to say, thanks, that's helpful information in terms of how somebody's perceived by others. Let's also hear, so it's kind of a blend. It's like looking at, knowing one person's perspective is one person's perspective, but that's why there's not one thing with assessment. It's like bringing it all, but that balancing act, Heather, of like, now I've got all this information and how do I balance it to find like the most accurate picture of this person and their abilities. So.
Yeah.
I think-
Sandra. Oh, go ahead. No, I want whoever that.
Okay,
I
it's
don't
Kim.
see you, so if you
Okay.
just could say who you are, because I have two screens with all the stuff covering it. So is that Kim?
Sure, it's Kim Harvey. One of the other thing with assessments, and we often get those sent to us from our voc rehab counselors,
Yeah.
is a lot of times it is the initial diagnosis of someone's IDD, and or it's written for a different purpose than what we're looking at assessment for. So quite often we get something where they're trying to get that participant benefits. They're trying to get them qualified. So they're writing every negative thing under a spotlight, and every positive trait is kind of muted. So the deficiencies are what shine to get those services that person needs. And so I think that's why using our own assessments and continually building into those is so important, because the purpose of what these assessments are for, night and day difference. And, in Best Buddies, everything we do is about seeing the potential and seeing the abilities. And we get these reports. And I mean, I saw my first report with someone who I'd known for years that happens to be a participant. And I cried after reading their assessment, because I was like, this is just not the person I know. So I think it's really important that we read and understand where that report was coming from, and what that psyche eval might mean, as opposed to what someone who's giving an assessment of their current abilities to be successful at work.
I love that, Kim. And actually, you touched on some things that we really wanted people to take away from this. And one of them is to recognize, for me, having come from the clinical realm, is recognizing the medical model and the bias towards describing things as deficits. And even looking at the language of intellectual and developmental disability and how it's morphed and changed and still sometimes used. So yes, not very strength-based. So I want to highlight that one of the things that I heard you say is consider who is doing the assessment and what questions are they looking to answer, because there's built-in bias based on both their training and the field they're in, so many things. So even if it's not your job to interpret psych evals, recognize that they tend to be more medical model, and you may need to build in some things, and Jeffrey's going to mention some later, that are more strength-based and person-centered. So you do want to have a balance with that medical model for sure.
Well,
And I think somebody had their hand up too.
Yeah, and let me say too, and Allie did, but now it's down. Rachel does. Oh, both of you. But one thing I want to say, and I please Allie and Rachel speak after me here, related to what you've all been talking about, is this is really fresh to me. I was just in Oregon last week. I was telling folks doing training, and I did a brief session on assessment, and we talked about things, so much of what you just hit on, like what you were just talking about, that, and I was saying that, diagnosis, perhaps outside of determining eligibility, may or may not have any relevance when it comes to the vocational realm, right? The disability itself will qualify someone for services, but many times, the strengths, the abilities, the struggles, the challenges may be, interpersonal, or maybe related to socially what's going on in someone's life. I was just talking to someone that's doing one of our online classes, we were typing to each other, and she was talking about someone she works with that all she meant when I asked her to name challenges. Well, she doesn't have transportation, and she's a single mom with 2 kids, and she's trying to find a place to live. And, you know, there's so many other aspects of chat that, you know, come to mind when it comes to challenges that may or may not have anything to do with the disability. But Allie and or Rachel, if you want to speak, I think you just gotta speak. Or was it, sometimes people mistakenly raise their hand?
We'll go with, no, Allie's pointing, but
no,
we'll go by, yeah. Allie, I
Oh,
think you were first, so go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So I definitely agree with what Heather said about just the whole process of working with the client is you're always assessing the situation. But I think specifically when it comes to intake and doing our intake paperwork, sometimes with clients, that kind of almost feels like an interview. And so maybe some of like the hardships or challenges that they've had previously, whether that be at school or at other job sites, those typically aren't revealed in that setting just because like it's more of like an interview vibe. So I was just wondering if you guys had any guidance of maybe questions to ask to kind of prompt the individual to maybe speak more on those challenges in the workplace, or because then like when those aren't introduced maybe early on in the process, they're revealed when they're actually at a job or working with an employer, which can sometimes, you know, not be great.
Allie, I had a picture of an artichoke, the heart of the matter. That's one of my other corny metaphors, right? But I don't have the picture right now. Stay tuned, because you're going to get more questions in a couple of resources that we will be sending you. I don't know if you have them yet. And there's some slides where I'm going over some of that. And you also remind me of one of the other key points, which is you're right, that informational first intake meeting, you know, might be intimidating. Maybe there's other people talking for someone, you know, and that goes back to taking the time to really get to know people in a variety of environments is so important, right? Because, but we will be sharing beaucoup questions for self-evaluation for job seekers that you're working with, you know, and just questions to dig deeper. So great point. Rachel?
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to take too much time, but I will just add kind of to what Allie was asking about. We also in Fresno here, we run a project search site as well. And so we recently did our interviews, which are interviews, and we also have a skills assessment component, but we, prior to the interview, get their IPPs. And so that's kind of that psychological evaluation. And sometimes we can have this, we look at the IPPs and there's red flags, like, I don't know about this, and it says that she has these behaviors. And so we've learned to ask some follow-up questions in that process. And I think that's the key, is you have kind of your set interview questions, but then you're going to follow up and say, so tell me, how do you respond to stress and things like that? And recently, as an example, we learned that this one individual, she had exhibited some pretty significant concerning behaviors in the past, but we also learned that her mother passed away.
Right.
And she moved, and there were all these other factors that were influencing how difficult it was for her to cope at the time. And so, yeah, just digging deeper and finding out more of what's going on in their world. And I think that's already been touched on, but yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Rachel, imagine if, so this is conversation going better than I ever imagined, and really appreciate all of you. Imagine if and this happens. Historically, people with disabilities, especially people with IDD, historically, these standardized tests are often not good news for them, right? And so what happens is, imagine if someone were just to look at that report and see those red flags and say, oh my gosh, this person can't work, you know, and that, sad to say, that happens. So but what you're saying, and I love what you're saying, which is going back to when I was talking about the big personality and all that, is assessment is about answering questions. So we're going to uncover these questions. And so doesn't mean don't look at the tool or the report, but it means we may have questions that come out of that. Let's follow up with those questions to gather more information and not just take it as gospel, you know, which sadly, I'm not saying you all do it, but sadly does happen and has always happened for people, particularly with IDD.
Yeah, and I just as a rule of thumb, typically when I do assessments of any kind, and a lot of mine have been, you know, like I was doing them more along the lines of counseling intake assessments and psychological type, but also, you know, just foster care home studies and different things where you're gathering a lot of information. People respond better to more narrative type questions and not having somebody sitting there with a form. When you have, and forms are helpful, and especially if you're learning your job and you want to make sure you know, tick all the boxes, there's that reality part of it. But if you can find a way of being able to take note, like to take enough notes that you can go back and fill in the form later, I would suggest trying to get away from that form mentality, because it's also hard for people. They answer differently when they feel like they give you very short answers. And somebody mentioned they find a lot out in that first 2 to 3 minutes of chatting that kind of informs the direction. So I would ask, you know, what are you there for? You're there to support somebody's success in employment or, you know, being integrated in the community. Think transition planning. What's your goal? Where do you want to be at? Tell me about, and what might get in the way, or tell me about a day in your life when you anticipate, like pretend you're getting ready for work. How do you feel? And those things, like, go to what the person might have most on their mind. Imagine yourself getting ready to go to a brand new job or interview. What are you worried about? Those are the first and foremost things that if you can kind of like look at, that often highlights where maybe they have fears around behaviors that they had that you can kind of delve into, but start with more narrative type questions, not too open-ended. With some people, if you're too open-ended, you know, that doesn't go well either. But
Yep.
But anyway, yeah, that more kind of narrative
Yep.
approach tends to
And
go
we'll
well.
be sharing questions, and let me, we'll love the conversation. We'll try to move forward, but I just want to give attention to a couple comments in chat because it's about you, not about just Aideen and I. Sandra had said earlier, and I have been thinking about this, Sandra, I think it's important to ask people what they don't like to do. People don't always know what they want to do, right? I was just talking about that as well last week in Oregon when I was doing my assessment presentation, that I would discover things that people would share about what their dislikes were. And I would always say, sometimes say, I'm really glad you shared that with me. That's really good to know. I'm sorry you had that experience, but it is invaluable, you know, going forward. And Chris reminded me, I do want to say, your functional assessment tool that I've seen, I actually think is quite comprehensive. And I have to be honest with you, I forgot, and Chris reminds us here, that apparently back in 2019, everything before the pandemic's a big blur to me right now. I helped shape and develop that. So no wonder I liked it. But it is comprehensive. So, you know, I actually think that is a good tool. But again, assessment isn't a form. It isn't a document. It's, you know, it's a tool that can guide us as well. Some people like Pam talked about stopping in when someone's volunteering. That's a great example of observation in the community, community-based assessment. When I say that, you know, community-based assessment just is a part of our work in employment services, supported employment, observing people in different environments.
The other thing that I want to be aware of too, and this, you'll hear this mentioned in trauma-informed care too, is that people have a response when they see you filling out forms, you're breaking eye contact, you are in a role where you look like you have power and status over you're determining something that gives you some power over somebody, especially if they have an intellectual and developmental disability. There's a feeling of, you know, high stakes with that. That brings up for a lot of people uncomfortable feelings. You know, I get nervous when I'm in a doctor's office. And I always think about, for those of you who have seen the Seinfeld episode where Elaine goes and the doctor writes difficult in her file, or she thinks they do, or whatever. And she's then always like, that's what she thinks. I'm always wondering what somebody's writing when I see them jot down in their notes. And I know it's in my file and it bothers me. And so imagine if you've had a history of learning disabilities, discrimination, just feeling kind of judged by other people, how that can bring up people's ability to really be their authentic and true selves and feel comfortable. So that's another thing to be thinking about, your style of how you're gathering information. You know, if you're breaking eye contact and just typing on your computer, it sometimes can come across in a way that feels overly judgmental.
Yeah.
So just some things to work on. We're all continually working on those things with fine tuning our jobs.
So I don't know if you know this, Aideen, but I have literally shown that Elaine Seinfeld clip in the doctor's office in trainings to talk about the dangers of documentation and assessment and things to be aware of. Because then at the end, remember, they had a file on Kramer too. So and I know that we addressed Rick's comment about those first 2 to 3 minutes and starting to go in new directions. And that was Rick, and Chris talks about, we're flexible here, let's, if we need to look at things a little differently, let's do that. So thanks for your great conversation. So the reminder here, and there's a schematic diagram up here. Now this says assessment in the employment process with a parenthetical for supported. So the supported employment process, for those that do supported employment, is assessment, and it's in red, is a very discrete, and it's intended to be discrete step in the process prior to doing that active one-on-one job development that we do. I mean, we should always be doing job development at all times because it's developing relationships. But that's another training. But assessment is a discrete process. Assessment also never ends, as some of you have said. It's ongoing, throughout the lifespan of our relationship with people. Someone may be in a job and we're a job coach and we're following people for a few years. We're still constantly assessing. And so I also want to say here that although this schematic diagram kind of demonstrates, we go through a process of assessment, job placement, job coaching, fading, extended services, that's supported employment. The reality is assessment, whether it might be a small a, we all have assessment. I have assessed and learned things about myself that have led to my being successful in employment, right? Yes, people we support have a job coach often and have a support person, but I always think, and maybe this is just me, we go through this process, all of us, in some way, shape, or form. We just don't call it these words. So assessment never ends, assessment. And I'm just going to quickly remind us too that, and I love I've used this iceberg description in a few different ways. So think of assessment as like viewing an iceberg. We really only see, there's a picture here of the tip of the iceberg above the water, and then below is about 90%. What we don't see, we see about 10% of who people are, So when we first meet someone, we only know what we can observe. It might be their behaviors, it might be the words they use, maybe it's their actions, maybe it's something we read in a report, right? And a bunch of words just popped up here, and this is what assessment is, digging deeper, as some of you have said. There's a number of things here. This is not an exhaustive list. Their skills, their abilities, people's life experiences. Maybe it says religion, could be people's background and experiences, things like that. Their politics, frankly, that are important to them. Dreams, capacities, there's so much for all of us, and so I think you've already kind of said it, but can we really get to know someone fully after only a couple interactions, right? The reality is it takes more. It takes more. So there's a picture of a puzzle here, and the puzzle pieces, think of assessment in this way. The puzzle pieces are scattered. So there's just like a puzzle, the puzzle pieces here all have different words on them. Someone's environmental preferences, their dislikes. There you go, Sandra, what people don't like. Their dreams, their goals, their interests, their work experiences, their supports, accommodations, and our job becomes to start to try to put that together. So we want to think of developing whatever you call it, what I would call, and others have called, a positive vocational profile, right? Starting to build, I use the word positive specifically because many times historically people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, people always looked at the negative and what people can't do. And the reality is we want to look at the positive. When we're first getting to know someone, the pieces are going to be all over the place, perhaps. That's relationship building, right? They're going to be scattered. They're going to be hidden from view. So our job is to start to put them together. One of the documents that I'm going to click here and hope it hyperlinks. There it is. It worked. One of the documents that you will, I forget if you have them now, Chris, or you will send them after. I can't remember.
We'll send them after.
Thank you. I thought that's that's what we do. So we will be sending you a number of resources. And this one says the results of assessment is something I've used in assessment training and as a practitioner as well. And this particular document is broken down into categories: skills, aptitudes, interests, their capacities and limitations. Can't forget about what's hard for people, as much as I want to talk about strengths. Work awareness, right? You know, sometimes people we work with have not had a lot of work experience, or maybe you've been in programs and services. Work is different. What is the impact of work on someone's schedule, right? How does someone respond to unfamiliar environments, right? So there are a host of questions here. I'm not going to review them all now, for you to consider as you're continuing to get to know job seekers that you support. And we will talk more about the puzzle eventually. But Dean, I think you were going to talk to us a little bit more here about the assessment process.
Yeah, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. We've covered some of these points, but just to kind of think about, these are the best practice kind of rules of thumb with assessment, in that any assessment, the way that you hear it described in any field, typically involves multiple types of tests, and some of them are formal. Maybe that somebody's sitting down and taking a standardized test, and some of them are more informal. So it might be some information you gather from talking to a family member would be more of an informal way of gathering information. But it, if possible, should involve some type of multidisciplinary team. And that doesn't mean that that's built into it. You may receive assessment information that came from one clinician who has a specific lens they're looking at, and they're using tools that were designed by different sources. But I think it's really important, especially if you're on the fence about something and it's not really clear, especially if you're leaning towards, boy, this person really doesn't seem employable. I would always err towards looking at more pieces of the puzzle and looking at other perspectives. Is there something you're missing? Is there some piece of it that, maybe they just underperformed at some point, or, as Jeffrey mentioned, just haven't had experience at all that make a difference. But even if it's you drawing in some colleagues and saying, hey, can you help me just look at what might I be missing? That kind of, it's called case conceptualization in some formats, of like looking at a case together and saying, what am I missing? Like, what's the context here? But also look at different points of information from different sources, different environments. So you want to find out what's going on in the community, what's going on in private settings at home, what's going on where they're comfortable versus where they're not comfortable. Who sees the true authentic self of that person is a good question. Might be family members. But also, I would say, look at different points in time. I would not disregard an old piece of information, like an old outdated report is useful historically for certain things, because it's a piece of the puzzle at one point in time that shows you historically, just like any of us, maybe from ourselves or family members, can tell you something that shaped us at one point in our life, or a critical piece of information, a fact about something we experienced, or maybe a medical thing that we have, something about us that's not going to change. But we will also process it differently, and it will show up differently at additional points in our life cycle. So you don't want to stop with a report that's really old. And there's actually a slide later in terms of clinical assessments that looks at kind of narrowing down what situations you should always say, I'm going to get a reevaluation clinically because of these things. So hold on to that. But there's not a general, like, you're not going to hear it as in the school setting, it's usually 3 years and then they'll reevaluate. But it's, for some people, if they get that IDD diagnosis and it's based on their development and certain aspects aren't going to change, sometimes that's all you're going to get, is that, yes, they have a developmental disability and blah, blah, blah. But then you want to add additional pieces of the puzzle, like other sources that followed that person at a different, like, that are more current, that came at another point in time. And you want to think about that biopsychosocial model, what's going on in the brain, what things can they measure, that are not going to change, but what are those other things, like social aspects of somebody, are definitely going to change over time. Personality develops, and people's preferences change over time. If you asked me what I wanted when I was 30, it's different than it is now, it's my preferences, my interests, my abilities, for all of us, they change over time. People's medical, how they're doing, like in terms of physically, how things show up and how it can impact other things. Like if I have diabetes and I also have IDD, when my blood sugar's high, I may present one way, and there may be something that shows up more when my blood sugar's high than it does when I'm, doing what I need to take care of my diabetes. And so there's all these other things that kind of come into play. So again, that's why, you want to look at different contexts and try to gather information. If you know somebody has different specialists, it may seem completely unrelated, but you want to really look at getting all of that historical information. Sometimes people are prescribed something medically that the doctor or someone will say, this has absolutely nothing to do with anything. And then you'll find out, gosh, this really does make a difference. Maybe somebody's really sensitive to a generic medication that they take that impacts their behavior in a certain way. So I wouldn't ever say that, there's information like, yes, it might go in the file and not be something that you need to have, but that all pieces of the puzzle could be relevant in some way. And also the thing to be thinking about is that a lot of clinicians are not trained to look at accommodation needs. And that's something that if you've worked in, the world of developmental disabilities, you've seen that need to look at accommodations, but just know that the person who did that psych eval oftentimes is not trained in considering whether somebody needed accommodations for that testing. So we should be looking at, if possible, if you know that you're sending somebody to get a reevaluation, try to find somebody who takes their accommodations into mind. There's also a really great resource through the APA that is written as it's meant to be for any clinician, and it gives them some strategies for assessing somebody with a disability and helps them to identify accommodations if they're not well versed in that. So Jeffrey, you can go on to the next slide.
Yeah, and I often say, big part of my job is training on the ADA, as some of you know, and accommodations are the window, right? We may hit the wall. Denise Bissonnette, one of the pioneers in supported employment, talks about this, so I'm stealing it from Denise, but, job development is a wall versus a window. We hit the wall. Oh my gosh, it says they need to carry 25 pounds 6 times a day, and they can't do that. So the job's out, or they need to be able to read at X level, right? The reality is the window might be the accommodation, right? And you all know about accommodations, I know, but it's that creativity. It's not just when someone's going into a job, even, as Aideen was saying, during the assessment process as well. There we go.
From a clinical standpoint, when you see that IDD diagnosis, intellectual and developmental disability, in current clinical standards, it should include both looking at their intellectual functioning, which historically was not the case. A lot of times when you hear people talk about IDD, they'll talk about, those IQ tests as if there's a number that if you fall within that number, then, it means, things in terms of what you're capable of in your life. Are you employable or not employable? Now they look more at adaptive functioning, which is basically the way it's defined is it's a person's ability to meet developmental and sociocultural standards for personal independence and social responsibility. And that's very broad. And we all recognize that there are a lot of things that come into play with that, much more than just a number. And so you will probably see situations where somebody has, and Jeffrey showed the really high IQ. There are individuals who have a really high IQ, but they have a lot of difficulty managing independent life. Maybe they can do these amazing math computations, but they can't get themselves dressed. I mean, there are some
can't make it through a job interview.
Right, yeah.
On a practice. I mean, just thinking of an example of that.
Yep. Yeah. So it's important because those are all, we can underestimate and overestimate in somebody's capabilities based on both of those things. I've seen people who need more supportive services, such as people that are on the autism spectrum, who colleges will admit them and expect all these things and not realize that they need some significant support when they move away for the first time and become independent, because it's those life skills, those adaptive skills that can be challenging. So anyway, you want to make sure that whoever is doing the initial diagnosis, that they, have they really accurately looked at those adaptive functioning skills? And Jeffrey, you can go on to the next slide. So basically, you're going to hear the term psychological assessment. And when you hear that, for those purposes, it's a comprehensive, as we've talked about, integration of information. It can include a lot of different things. So some of them are standardized tests, some of them are surveys. Sometimes they're structured interviews, and sometimes it may be more of an informal process. Sometimes they're inviting other family members and caregivers in. Sometimes they're not. Some clinicians are really good about gathering other records. Sometimes not. There's not really a list that says you have to do this. It's really an ethical standard. Like, at what point is somebody saying they've gathered enough information? The thing to be aware of, though, is that there's a lot that comes into play with, first of all, who ordered and requested the testing, and what are they asking for from the person, who's paying for it, and what are the purposes that they have. So if you have somebody from VR, they are trained to look at employment and implications for employment. The general psychologist is not often trained to look at that. They are trained to look at just general kind of global functioning, and their focus is usually around talking about the things that are coming up as challenges. And the default is often, has been historically, to think this person is going to be too stressed with work, and so we're not going to add that. It's going to be too challenging. And oftentimes clinicians are not really well trained in recognizing the benefits and the recovery that work can bring. So that is a bias that I feel like is really kind of built in. And honestly, a lot of the systems that people have access to clinicians benefit by people not working, because they have very flexible schedules. They can go to appointments anytime, every week. And so there are some things that I've often seen, that people almost feel like there's a relief when a clinician can say that somebody is able to receive benefits and not well enough to work. So some considerations, who requested or paid for an assessment? What are they asking? Because that will drive the type of assessments that the person uses. If you look on, if you go on to Pearson's assessments, that's where a lot of psychologists will order their assessments. It's used for other purposes, and there are other places. But go on there and look at all the different types of tests, and it really is up to the clinician and, or wherever they work, to decide, what are we going to pay for? How many? They all have different things that they're looking for and measure. But it's pretty open-ended. So they're looking a little bit at who's requesting this, what am I looking for, but it's a built-in bias. I am looking for tests, and those tests are looking for certain things. We're going to see what we shine the light on. We're not going to see the things that we're not shining the light on, which might be just as relevant. Also think about, if it was done in school, there are different categories of classifying students in school systems. I actually just met with an individual for another project who is a young adult with a disability, who was diagnosed with a mild intellectual and developmental disability, and is working with, worked with the governor of their state to declassify themselves. And to, in the end, I think they had, it was an inaccurate diagnosis, that the person did not actually have IDD. I mean, I think that there was trauma, there was anxiety, some other things, but just recognize, there are certain classifications that differ. Schools oftentimes have school psychologists who are doing a different type of testing than you would find with a clinical psychologist. You wouldn't find a neuropsychologist in a school. So if somebody has, if you're trying to find out more about, maybe somebody had a traumatic brain injury, and you want to measure certain things that their brain is able to do or not do in terms of abilities, you would want more of a neuropsychological, or someplace that can look at some of the medical imaging. And that would be a different thing you would be asking, different set of tests. So it is helpful a little bit to understand that you can, to some extent, drive some of the results by the type of assessment and the person's background and what they're trained in. And also, I heard people mention you find a lot from talking to the person themselves. What I would often do, there were some standardized tests, like there's some, the there's a personality test. It's like the 16 PF or something that we would use, and some other standardized tests that people would do as intake at the counseling office where I worked. And so they would give some very helpful reports, which showed me what the results were, how to interpret them. And what I would often do is sit down with the person and kind of put in my own words, this is a summary of what this information told me. Tell me about, does that ring true with what you know about yourself? Do you feel like this is an accurate picture of yourself? And you might want to adapt the language, but present it as something to talk about, not as a finding, as if this is a fact about you. Because if any of you have had anything done, I don't know if you've ever sat on the other side of having an assessment and saying, oh my gosh, like if I believe that about myself, I'm going to think terrible things about myself, because you know it's not accurate. So I think it is helpful to just, to some extent, and there's a movement in rehabilitation services to have more open documents where people actually get to see results from assessments, and they know what you're writing in your notes. So there's not that feeling of the Elaine, you know, they're writing something secret in my file. But also the last part of that is, does it line up with what you observe and know to be true? And I recently was talking with somebody who kind of made that point that, like, I was reading all these things, that's not the person that I saw. You know, and so maybe you see something with new eyes that somebody else didn't see. And that's really important. So look at those different observations and pay attention to that. You know, is there more information you can gather? Are you going to give somebody a chance because maybe nobody else in their life ever gave them a chance or gave them any hope? Jeffrey.
I remember, so you made me think of when I was working in employment services. And at one point I used to kind of coordinate our intake somewhere along the way. And I remember we got and so I would have to look at the referrals initially and, you know, pass them, do the intake, pass them on to the employment staff, whatever, make some judgments and assessments of my own. So I got this referral on this young man who was graduating from high school. And I remember looking at it and thinking, oh my gosh, it talked about all these behaviors and aggression and, you know, and sitting in my seat, you know, thinking, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to work? I hadn't met him yet. Work with this person. How am I going to have the conversation with the employment staff and be, you know, all that stuff. Well, I met this young man and it's his support people, and it was like the polar opposite. And come to find out, much of what was happening in his life at the time of that was in high school. He was bullied tremendously. He was going through it, you know, that context, because ultimately when we worked with him, the staff that worked with him loved him. He got employed. He was very successful. But if you were to look at that report, I would, you know, and stopped there. Someone mentioned the red flags before. I would have ran the other way. Fortunately, we dug a little deeper. We moved forward. We had conversations. We did all of that. Sadly, many times for people with disabilities, folks sometimes don't get past that report, you know, that, you know, deficit-based report.
And I think there's, we pass on anecdotal pieces of information sometimes along the way that bias other people, you know, like, oh, I'm going to give you this referral. I just saw this on that, you know, and they cause people, we have to look at our own bias. And I'm going to share a little bit, you know, if hygiene stuff really grosses you out, I'm telling you this because this is something that really illustrates the point that we have to look at how we react to information. I was working on a project and people said, you know, this young adult girl, well, she was a teenage girl, oh, she's not going to be able to be placed in a job. She does not use feminine products when she needs to, and she basically just sits on chairs and bleeds on chairs. And you can, and I feel that cringe in you, like, oh, gross. Where am I going to bring her? What's that going to be? And, you know, it's like any other behavior. There's a reason behind it. She doesn't want to do that. She maybe doesn't know it's appropriate. So I kind of was like, okay, well, let me take that curiosity standpoint. Let me just go to her house. Let me ask her, you know, and you have to talk sometimes directly about the thing that makes other people cringe. Hey, I heard this thing mentioned. I had to become comfortable saying to her, I've heard stories that you bleed on chairs. What's up with that? Like, tell me about that. She'd been sexually abused, and using tampons was re-traumatizing for her. So there were some things, we talked about, well, nobody had ever introduced her to alternatives to tampons. We had a conversation. So there were some practical things. So if we could kind of get past that, like, I think sometimes people don't have access to employment because of the biases and stories that get passed on that unfortunately have maybe some practical solutions.
Yeah. And Nadine, this is not in this training, but you just reminded me of one of my favorite, because you just did it with that example of that girl you worked with. And it's the concepts of notice and wonder. You've heard us talk about this, right? I'll give credit to our colleague, Wendy Quarles, who would often talk about these concepts. And it's the idea during assessment or anytime as we're getting to know somebody, we notice a lot of things about them, but there's things we wonder and that we are afraid to ask because they're personal or they're uncomfortable. Certainly I would be uncomfortable talking about that, but or if you've ever had to have the hygiene conversation, but you just did it because the questions we have, the things we wonder about someone based on what we have noticed in a report or whatever through observation form the basis of our assessment. Those questions. I noticed, that this was going on, and I wonder what that's all about. If you could tell me a little bit more, right? And when you did that, how, right, with what you learned was just monumental, right? And so it's always just having that spirit of curiosity, not being afraid to ask questions, dig a little deeper. Sometimes it might be those uncomfortable questions. I noticed there's several gaps in your resume. You were at a job for a month or 2 months. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about what that was about, right? I use it with anything.
Yeah. Good points. And that notice and wonder and just, hey, tell me about those motivational interviewing type questions, like conversation. This just gives you an idea when they talk about adaptive skills in terms of kind of the mental health world, each bucket contains a lot of different types of things. And I think the things that you want to make sure have really been accurately assessed are the things that might show up at work beyond the actual like tasks of, okay, we got to think about how are their math skills and how's that going to translate into their job duties. But just as important that sometimes is overlooked is how are they going to communicate with their coworkers? How are they going to organize themselves in order to, get to work? And how are they going to manage their money so that they are, that what they're making is able to help them keep their housing, those kinds of things. So Jeffrey, you can move on with that.
Okay.
Thanks.
There you go.
And some things that can actually influence how somebody is looking at that adaptive functioning. You may find that somebody went to a clinician who looked at that, but they may not recognize some of the things that can skew those results. So sometimes we mentioned that they're not always aware of accommodations. Somebody might have a way of communicating that is not known to the interviewer. So oftentimes they will recite things verbally. And so in certain cases, it's important that they're assessing auditory processing, and it's important that it's read. But it could be that information could be written down for the person, and that would be an accommodation for somebody who has trouble. Maybe they communicate better by reading something, or maybe they can't express it verbally, but they could answer using a picture, some type of picture communication. But that's important. We talked about their opportunities. Did they even have an opportunity to try some earlier work experiences? Do they have support at home? How motivated are they? And we don't want to assume that that's something that is the person's fault, but sometimes people are going to show you their abilities because they're motivated, but there might be some hidden things that even they're not aware of, or maybe they present a certain way. Yeah.
Nadine, that opportunity just struck a nerve with me, or a chord with me, because so often people with significant disabilities have not had the opportunity, which means
right. Yep.
That's how, I know many of you know this, but that's how we learn, right? Through trial and error, through the school of hard knocks, through having successes, through getting positive feedback in life, through those think about things I did in jobs when I was a teenager that, I can't believe,
Right.
I'm a relatively grown man, but again, those opportunities taught me so much. And many times, remember, some of the people we support have had limited expectations and limited opportunity, which might mean limited view of what I think I can do, limited esteem, and so forth.
Yeah, that life experience
Yeah.
is invaluable. Yeah. Yeah, and other things to think about, are there cultural differences that weren't accounted for? Sometimes it's language itself and somebody, maybe misinterpreting how things are used. There's a lot of like there are things like inferences that are made that are very based in Western cultures where it can skew results. Some results, it's interesting if you ever get a psychological report, try to see if like oftentimes there should be a description about the type of test that they used, but they sometimes will tell how it was validated and it is kind of interesting to see who it might not work well with and some of the pieces that are there because there are biases with culture. Sometimes people have medical conditions that if the clinician's not aware of it, they might not realize. A good example is when people have Lyme's disease, it can cause pretty significant brain fog, and especially as somebody's being treated. And so people might think, oh, well, the person's under the care of a doctor, that doesn't come into play. But for months and sometimes years afterwards, people can have a brain fog that maybe looks like it's part of, the intellectual and developmental disability, but it could be something that if, down the road, that piece of information might change based on where the person's at with their treatment. So I'll feel free to put things in the chat if you want to. Jeffrey, if you want to move on, a term that is just helpful to understand is that validity can really affect a lot of things. Is it measuring the thing that it is supposed to be measuring? Are you really measuring somebody's ability to do this task, or are you measuring how quickly they can do the task? So think about, this makes me think of math tests. So when I was in high school, I had a lot of anxiety related to math tests, and it took me a long time to process. Had I known back then about 504 accommodations, I would have probably benefited from extra time on tests, because oftentimes if I was given double the time on my own, I could do them in my homework. What I realized was it took me a tremendous amount of time. And then I think also being measured and knowing the time was ticking increased my anxiety. But think about, is the test measuring whether somebody really knows the material, or is there something else going on? So there can be a lot of things like processing speed, their ability to express their answers verbally, their ability to understand that receptive language. Do they understand the question being asked? A lot of executive function skills. So if you would read off a paragraph of something to somebody who has trouble with their short-term memory, they may know the answer if it was written down and they could have all the information, but you might get an inaccurate answer because they can only hold certain pieces in their brain at the same time. And Jeffrey, you can go on to the next one. So some things to keep in mind to look at when you're looking at kind of the clinical evaluation: pacing. So that it should really be based on the client, whoever the client is to that evaluator, their comfort level, not the schedule of that person. And this is going to be hard because you have limited access sometimes, but if possible, can it be broken up so that the person can have a slower pace? Is the person, and sometimes you can prompt the evaluator and say, as an accommodation, we would like you to pause this amount of time after you read a question, or offer to re-ask a question, repeat a question. Stamina. Sometimes people have mental and physical fatigue. So they've found that some individuals really can only tolerate 30 to 90 minutes of testing at a time and need things broken up over several sessions. So just some things to keep in mind. Whatever testing they underwent, how long did it take? And were there some of these competing factors that might have skewed the results a little bit? And
I think about my 20-year-old son who's gotten VR services. I always say life meets art, or art meets life, whatever we call it. And if you were to, he's the type that doesn't sit still too well, and for a variety of reasons. And if you were to assess him in a formal way and ask him to sit and come daily and sit for several hours and go through, he would hate it. And it could be easy to say, well, he didn't show up, or he came and he didn't attend to the test that we were doing, versus, he's out now working in a construction job where he can be active and physical. And, it really makes me, I try to apply some of these concepts sometimes, Aideen, even just to my own life experiences, right? And all of a sudden it makes it very real, doesn't it, when we think about people we know and care about.
Yeah, and I think it also brings up that idea that there's multiple forms of intelligence, you know, and
Absolutely.
that some people, there is a certain type of intelligence with certain trades that, you know, I may be able to compute, is it computate, whatever, this math problem, which is not, math is not my thing, but as an example, I may be able to do that really well, but maybe I am not creative and couldn't, you know, musically create something that somebody else could. So there's a variety of different things, and the standard test doesn't measure some of those things. So look at some of those multiple forms of intelligence and how can you help people do some of those assessments so that you can look at strengths that they have. And then you can move on. Yeah. So this was kind of interesting. In general, no specific test or procedure can accurately predict one's overall employability. I mean, they've found that there are people who defy the odds in terms of what assessments say all the time. Or, you know, you hear stories of people who, you know, they went through school and everybody said they're never going to be able to do this, they're never going to be able to do that. And they're really motivated. Or there's, you know, sometimes there are huge developmental growth periods that happen that are still underway well into the 20s. Executive function develops in, you know, continues to develop and evolve into the mid-20s. And so even if somebody has IDD and falls within, you know, maybe they will always have some level of intellectual and developmental disability, but within that, there may be things that their brain still develops and learns how to compensate for. And maybe their neurons, because their brain is still being formed, that they're able to find ways around where there are things that initially it didn't look like they would be capable of doing, that they are. So that's, again, why it's important to look at if somebody had an assessment that was done while they were still in school. Rule of thumb is I would have down the line, if it's been more than a few years, you would want to look at a later point in adulthood. So like sometime after the mid-20s, given the fact that the brain is still developing so much. So yeah, so look at that motivation. Motivation is huge for people in terms of predicting their success. And Jeffrey, you can move on to the next.
Well, and that motivation also goes to observations in different environments, in different settings, can make a huge difference, because, you know, we all have things that jazz us and then things that, you know, scare us or bore us or that we're just not interested in, right? And so it really motivation is what it's all about, and determining particularly not just the external motivation, the paycheck, although that's important, but what is that internal motivation when it comes to someone being a vocational being and getting a job, whatever. You know, for a lot of us, the internal motivation might be self-esteem, might be interaction with colleagues and feeling like we're learning and growing and, you know, making a difference in our work, whatever it might be. Try to discover what that is for everyone that we work with.
Well, and I think to go back to, I don't know if it was Heather who talked about, you know, sometimes you're hearing from the parents and family members, and it's really important to figure out, they may have a different idea of what should be motivating than is, you know, so it's important to try to connect that relevance from the beginning. Well, what makes you want to work, and what kind of life do you want? And maybe, I mean, honestly, there are a lot of young people in general who will say, I want to work so that I don't really care what job I do. I have this passion that I want to have the money to do. So like, I want a simple job without a lot of stress so that I can go buy X, Y, and Z or whatever. That's okay.
Right.
That's important for you to know, because they might be motivated by different things.
You know, it makes me think of, once in a while, didn't come up often, I would have someone say to me, well, what if the parents, the legal guardian, and they have a goal, blah, 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 and the person themselves, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, this is an illegal decision, first of all, right? We're talking about someone's desires and interests and dreams, right? And I would always say, ultimately, the philosophy of this work that we do in supported employment services, you know, regardless of the legal guardian, is we follow the dreams and desires and wishes and motivations of the job seeker themselves, right? It would be contrary to our mission, right? To our belief, to the model of the work that we do, to follow a goal that is imposed on someone by someone else. In fact, there's a quote by Daniel Pink. He wrote this book about motivation called Drive, and it's something like, goals imposed on us by others can have disastrous consequences, right? Or something like that. and I moved us forward. I hope that was
Oh,
okay.
yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, and I think I've touched on some of these, but this actually was this was helpful. And you can look more at the link that's at the bottom of this, but it was kind of rules of thumb for when you might want to consider retesting. And again, I said there's not like a specific, it depends on context and also costs. Like it can be costly to get assessments, and sometimes you're not going to get approval from insurance, or the person's not going to have the funding. But look at, are the person's needs, were they well understood? And again, that goes back to the validity. Are they measuring what they should be measuring? Are they, oftentimes, like if somebody had something done in a school setting, you'll find that there should have been an outside evaluator. The needs of the person and the nuances of a certain, type of disability didn't come into play or something. So we want to be looking at, was there something that wasn't understood? So do we need to order some additional type of testing or redo the entire testing or something? Also, if the person has had no testing in their adulthood, I mentioned that, you want to redo that sometime after their mid-20s. Also think about future planning needs. That again goes back to the type of person you're going to go to. Are we looking at establishing a level of independence? Are we looking at employment? What are their hopes and dreams? Because again, that's going to drive the types of questions you're going to ask, which is going to drive the types of actual tests that they're going to use to inform the process, which is going to directly connect to their output, which is their recommendations of next steps, treatment plan, goals, those kinds of things. So it's really important to just inform them. What are the person's needs, wants, desires? If you're in post-secondary education, generally they'll say they should be updated after, every 3 years is kind of their reeval period. If somebody goes into a post-secondary education, oftentimes, like there's a period of time you can get it paid for in school. So they'll say, before somebody leaves school, try to get that done if you can get the school, to pay for that. If you can get VR to pay for one, anytime you can get somebody the benefit of having a funder who's going to provide it free of cost, it can be helpful, as long as it's seen as just a piece of information and not something that speaks to, you don't want people to believe if there are things that are in there that show their challenges. You want them to be seen more holistically with their strengths.
It's that there's the puzzle. Remember the puzzle earlier, with the pieces all scattered?
Yep.
There was a piece that said, I don't think there was a testing, but it's a piece of the puzzle. There's nothing wrong with looking at the information. It can tell us something, but it's one piece. It shouldn't be the whole puzzle. Yes,
exactly. Yeah. If there's going to be a new psychiatric diagnosis made, it can be helpful to make sure, do you have somebody who can really understand those pieces of it? Sometimes there are psychiatric, psychiatric things that can skew results. Like it could look like somebody is, cognitively not able to do something. If you're going to add some kind of like new diagnosis on top of that original diagnosis, you might want to do some further assessment to kind of flesh things out. Or you might realize that maybe there was an underlying mental health condition like anxiety that wasn't accounted for or recognized in a previous evaluation that was done. So you now want to bring that and say, okay, now can you redo this, this IDD assessment and make sure that it wasn't really that it was anxiety symptoms that the person who initially did that didn't pick up on. Also, if you have seen any significant unexplained changes in behavior, it can be helpful to get another evaluation. So this person was able to take care of their hygiene independently, and suddenly within a short period of time, they've seen some significant regression. And so you definitely want to get more information. Sometimes there's something medically going on that kind of just popped up, but that's a good time, so I used to work in a nursing home. Part of the morning stand-up that they had was significant changes. There was a code for that, because anytime you saw that, maybe somebody looked like there was a mental health diagnosis going on, or cognitively there was a change, the person maybe actually had like a urinary tract infection. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't always mean you're sending them for a diagnosis, you're getting more information. So another rule of thumb is, don't forget about the role of the primary care provider. It could look clinical, but there could actually be a very understandable biological something going on, and oftentimes like that person who's the primary care person should be overseeing all of the results of everything because they hold the history of that person's information. So you always want to keep them looped in because they might want to do blood work. They might want to do, things that will avoid maybe an unnecessary and costly assessment otherwise. So,
Well, Aideen, I read something, and I've used this to inform the different class I teach about understanding challenging behaviors in the workplace, we call it. And one of the things that this person talked about in this research article, well, it was an article, I don't think it was research, but talked about was the fact that, particularly, I think he was speaking to people about people with IDD, is that so often what he says is that when there was a behavior that would crop up or that would exist, that ultimately it had a medical, something going on medically. Maybe it was pain or discomfort, and that maybe it's just something the person themselves wouldn't communicate, right? And so I think that is such an important point that you mentioned about that.
Yeah, because I would say generally mental health things, things that are characteristically related to the actual IDD tend to happen over time. They're patterns of behavior. And even in the psychiatric realm, a lot of times when somebody would have a sudden onset of symptoms and family members would say, this person became aggressive or anxious overnight. A lot of times it was something like Lyme's disease, where it was like a bacteria. There's a lot of bacterial infections. COVID has I learned this recently. COVID has and actually I learned that potentially any illness that somebody's had that's a virus has a kickback effect of afterwards creating inflammation that can look like psychiatric disorders and it can also impact people cognitively. So yeah, so I think just general rule of thumb is if you see a dramatic change in behavior, a doctor is a good way to check first because they will check those things like blood work and rule out infection and other things. And those things typically need to be addressed more quickly because they typically tend to be, like, hey, that infection sometimes is at a level where it's really could be disastrous if somebody doesn't get that taken care of right away.
Well, and by the way, this is also when I talk about challenging behaviors, I actually have a slide that talks about, indicators of why, what might lead to a behavior or why someone might be exhibiting a behavior. And one of the things on the list is significant, may not be called this exactly, but it's unexplained changes in behavior. Someone is behaving in a way that's acting in a way that's different than what is typical. And it doesn't always mean, like you said, Aideen, that, okay, we need to retest. It could be, okay, here's an example. It's a twist on what you're talking about, but still the same concept. Have you ever worked with someone who, when they started their job and you're supporting them on the job, they're going gangbusters, they're doing a great job, they're motivated, then, time goes on, maybe it's months, a year, several years, however long, and you're like, what's going on here? They used to be able to, they were excelling in this job task, and now they're not doing it anymore. They're not, I don't know, they're not stocking the shelves in the way that they used to, and they're sloppy and they're missing things. And it could be, yes, it could be all the other things we just talked about, or it could just be someone's bored and wants to change, and doesn't, again, that's another example of just a change in behavior could be one of those clues, right? That, because we might say, oh, see, they don't want to work anymore. They're tired of work and they'd rather, when the reality is maybe just like any of us, the person wants something different in their life, right? It's like we're detectives in this work and there's so much we have to take in.
You can go on ahead.
All right. So a few tools. The beauty of trainings like this is sometimes we've talked about things already. Sometimes there's a few things I'll go over here moving forward that perhaps we haven't. So a few of the tools, and they are handouts that you will receive after the training. I'm going to go over a couple of them in subsequent slides. One, the self-evaluation tool, I'll go over in a minute. There's a positive profile tool. It's nothing fancy. I'll share that in a minute. The community assessment form, I don't have that hyperlinked, but remember I talked about assessing and getting to know people in a variety of environments. There's actually, I believe we'll be sending you a document that is kind of a form that you can use to sort of guide that process. These tools don't have to be anything formal you do. They can be things informal that guide you as well. I shared the results of a test assessment on screen. Remember those questions and the different categories. And I will be going over what we call the discrepancy analysis. Sometimes we call it the job match model, and this really gets to the value of accommodations. And I know you've talked about that a lot today, Aideen. So as we've already said, and there's an gathering, we want to gather multiple perspectives. I know we've talked about this. There's a couple things I'm going to keep, driving the point home, right? We want to talk to their support network, people in the job seeker's life, whomever they may be. Who are those key people that know the individual, right? That know the person, that have a perspective that might be valuable. Could be family, could be friends, could be that volunteer, whoever said they were stopping at the volunteer experience, talking to the person there. Could be someone from the residence or another program. Could be someone from their school if they aren't too far out of school. Could be someone from a past job, but gathering that information across many situations, we want multiple sources of input. It's going to give us a much clearer picture of who someone is, which is why assessment ought to be, the best assessments as comprehensive as it can possibly be. Frankly, not just related to sort of what we're looking for work, but just big picture about who someone is, and what environments they excel in, what environments are difficult, what type of people, what work culture is important. It's often what makes or breaks the job. Environmentally, indoors, outdoors, hot, cold, bright lights, a lot of people, distractions, not noises, all those kinds of, that type of stimulation. So there's a bunch of people in this image here kind of looking at an elephant, and based upon where they are with the elephant, one person's by the big, huge leg and says it's a tree. Another person is by only seeing the tusks, says it's a spear. Someone is just kind of at the huge body and saying it's a wall. Someone's by the tail, it's a rope, right? If we only, it's sort of a neat concept. If we only look at pieces of who someone is, we're only going to have one perspective, and we have to try as much as possible to put those pieces together. So I've mentioned community-based assessments. We want to, these are just, a community-based assessment could just be, let's go out to the coffee shop, right? Let's see how someone interacts in that type of environment. Do they go up and place their own order? Do they wait for you to do it? Do they have money? Do they know how to handle money? How are they when they're interacting in that environment? It can tell us so much, right? So, because it occurs, community-based assessment occurs, as you might imagine, naturally in the community, right? Some of you mentioned earlier about the interview process of getting to know the job seeker, right? An assessment. And this really does feed into this, that sitting down in a formal setting and talking and asking questions, and I'm going to give you questions because they certainly have value and merit, but will not always be the best way. Let me say this, is not the only way to get to know someone, right? Because in different settings and my 16-year-old son, I always say, is a man of few words. He can talk. He just is not interested in having big, long conversations. But man, if you get him out and you go out in the community and you're talking about sports, he loves sports, all of a sudden you'll see a whole new person, right? Depending on the situation, the setting, and the environment. So the community, I will tell you that the community-based, the form that you'll get after the document, basically what it is, and you can think about this conceptually or practically in your work, is it has fields on the form where you essentially would observe someone in a setting. Maybe they're trying out a job. Maybe they're in a volunteer experience. Maybe they're just out in the community engaging in some sort of activity. And then, there's different categories of where you would assess how, what are your observations of this person? And actually, it's also asking other people in the person's life, even if you're not actively in the community with someone, talking to some of their important others in their lives about how they are in different situations, not just, situations that they're comfortable with, but what about when something's uncomfortable? What about when something's new? That's why I often say, and not just I, it is often said that assessment should also be about perhaps introducing someone to what might be a new or unfamiliar environment, right? It's pushing gently someone beyond, maybe just like with any of us, beyond their comfort zone. Because how are we gonna know how someone might interact, act, or behave if they haven't had, there's that word opportunity again, Nadine, if someone hasn't had that opportunity to try? It's kind of that dignity of risk. So work tryouts can be really invaluable, where someone's trying out an activity. I mean, here in New York, we have formal work tryouts through VR where they'll pay the employer, but it could even be, just informal. You have a relationship with the employer, hey, could I have someone come in and just, try this out for an hour? We're just trying to get a sense of how they might be in this job. It actually, by the way, can be another relationship building activity. Aside from just asking employers to hire someone, the stakes are a lot lower if we're just asking for an hour of their time to observe. Community-based assessment, so important. So one of the other tools that you will get, and I think this one, I'm just going to click on it. There it is. So I'm not going to go over all this. I have it on the slides, but our late great executive director, Thomas Golden, and our colleague, Carol Blessing, who is retiring, we just found out, came up with this tool. And it's really about, what we would call self-evaluation. It's giving the person the opportunity to really think and reflect on who they are, right? Many times some people that we work with and support haven't been asked what they want to do, haven't been asked what's important to them, or haven't had that voice, right? Because maybe other people are doing the talking for them, or maybe the expectation just hasn't been there, right? Sometimes the bar can be set so low for folks. And so it really is these questions, and these are broken down into different categories. I cherry picked a few here on the slides just to go over to get the wheels spinning about some things we might ask and what we might want to know. Martin Luther King once said, our questions in life are everything, and something about, it shapes our world, it shapes our reality. So just as I talk about this in job development, think about the questions we want to ask as job developers, as we engage with employers. We want to do the same thing with job seekers. To come to think about it, assessment with job seekers, in a sense, we assess employers as well. All roads for me lead to job development. I can't help myself. So we want to know about, obviously, people's attributes, their talents, their skills, their abilities. Few questions. What kind of things are you really good at doing? Or name 3 things you like about yourself. Or what do you think most people really like about you? I like that one because it kind of third persons it. That would often be my interview question. Hey, Dean, if I were going to talk to one of your former coworkers, what would they tell me about you? That was one of my favorite questions because it was kind of like from a different perspective. Maybe if you have any questions you like to ask or things you like to do to uncover attributes and talents, let us know in the chat.
Yeah, just recently we are engaging in some interviews with some young adults, youth and young adults with disabilities. And the question is, we start with, what would other people say about you? And it's followed by, what is something you're really proud of yourself about? And another question we ask about their strengths. It was much harder for them to answer questions about naming their strengths was much harder for them. So just keep that in mind, that you might be missing, if the question is phrased a different way, what you might run into is lack of confidence and lack of believing certain things. And so I think, Jeffrey, I think you're right, that perspective of, and they would say, well, my teachers have said this. I don't know why they think that, but they've said blah, blah, blah.
Well, think about it. Like, for me, if you ask me that question, what do you like about yourself? What are you good at? There is perhaps sometimes, heaven forbid, an element of humility, right? Oh, I got to talk about myself. But if you ask Dean's going to tell you this, this, and this. Or if you ask me what Dean might say about me, I might say, oh, well, Dean and I do a lot of trainings and we've traveled together. And so she might say this, or she might say this. It changes, even just for me, as I'm thinking about it right now. Or if you ask Dean, what's Jeffrey good at? Tell me a little bit about Jeffrey. You're going to get Dean's sort of work-related perspective, perhaps a little personal, because we certainly hung out together when we travel for work. But if you ask my son, tell me about your dad. Believe me, you're going to get a very different perspective. None of it's right, wrong, good, bad. But it's all valuable. It's all a piece of that puzzle. We want to know about, and sometimes you might think this is a stretch, and I might even ask you, why would we want to know about someone's core values and ideals? You know, we want to get to know who someone is, because that does help when it comes to matching to jobs and work environments in the community. Some things that we might ask. Again, remember, these questions aren't just about work environments, you know, they're more holistic. What do you think are the most important qualities for any person to have, and why? That certainly can tell you. That's a little easier to answer too than tell me about yourself. What are your hopes for the future? Who do you see yourself becoming? You know, it's that. I used to like back when I was in social work school, Aideen, that miracle question. You know, if you could wave the magic wand and your life would look any certain way, what would it look like? I love that, right? I think oh no, there's not one more there. And by the way, the other thing I would often do, I don't know what you think about this, but sometimes you'd get as my teenagers do with me. I don't know. I've never had that happen. I have no idea, right? I would sometimes say to people, no, more playfully than anything. I don't know isn't allowed. You can't say it. And they would say, well, I'm not sure. I'd say, then make something up. Because guess what? Maybe that's the miracle question. In the making something up, there's engagement, and there might be something that, you pull out of it. I don't know if you've ever done that, Aideen, with folks. You've worked a lot with people, where, you get that sort of, I don't want to call it apathy because it might not be apathy, just might be uncertainty or lack of self-esteem, and encouraging that engagement by saying, there's no wrong answer. I kind of do it with all of you. So I say that a lot in training because I really do believe in it. But Aideen, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I've done the same thing of like, well, hypothetically, like, let's just use your imagination. Imagine you were in that situation tomorrow, or, whatever. What's the part in your head that would like to do this thing or whatever? And yeah, I think, helping people to just take the time and pause is important, because it's often just if you actually make the person mindful of like, no, I really want to hear your answer. Like, I'm curious. Like, I really want. It's not about just me filling in this blank. It's about, I want to hear a story about this.
Well, it's why we call self-evaluation questions, because it's maybe many times we're not asked, at our annual review, we might be asked, and that can be challenging. It's a whole other thing, even after all these years of working. But many times people aren't asked to sort of think and reflect. And ultimately, if someone doesn't want to answer, obviously there's a pass, but it's not maybe taking, I don't know, for the answer the first time.
I will say, though, sometimes the way people process things, it is hard for some people if it's too open-ended.
Yeah.
So ask yourself if it's about the open-endedness of the question, because you might be able to offer some choices. So you might say, for example, if you ask some people, what kind of job do you want? If they haven't had a lot of experiences, that question is overwhelming. So maybe, hey, like, would you rather could be a fun game to play. Would you rather be somebody who worked with your hands or somebody who worked with your head? Would you rather this or that? You can play around and, even have fun with it. But think about whether you can limit it, because that is hard for some people to answer open-ended questions.
Certainly, absolutely, and intimidating. And I always liken it to if you go to a restaurant and there's no menu and they say, what would you like to order? I don't know, I don't have a menu, right? So interests, experiences, skills, hobbies, just things people like to do, things like, and there's many more questions in the tool. What are some ways, your favorite ways to spend time? What things do you like to do? Is it important for you to get a job? Why? Love that one, right? Sort of gets right to, and sometimes the question might even be not, but this one here says, what are some things you disliked about your past work? There's your, Sandra asked that, or stated that earlier, how valuable it can be to learn what someone didn't like. And many times we can talk about that. Usually it might be a person or a supervisor or something in the work environment. But the other thing, is it important for you to get a job? I might sometimes even ask, is there anyone in your life that maybe doesn't want you to work or isn't so sure about this work thing? Because that could uncover some other aspects of what's going on. I remember someone we worked with once, we come to find out she was the babysitter for her niece quite a bit, and they relied on her. And all of a sudden we realized that could potentially be a roadblock. So it's something we had to navigate. And it was good that we had that information before we had the job offer, and before we learned that too late. We want to know people's preferences, their priorities, things like, what would you say is your most important goal? What will help you achieve your goal or dream? Will you get there? What do you think might hold you back, or what might get in the way, right? Now, as Aideen said, we need to make them, the thing with anything, the answer is always yes. In fact, I have a little plaque here. Can you see it? It says start with yes. The answer is always yes. And that depending on the person and the situation, we have to know the person, right? So we may have to craft or adapt questions to meet the needs of the situation. And we want to know about people's support needs, right? Certainly we can, I think documentation reports can be valuable, but just from in the person's own words, what might you need? People come to us typically because there's a need, there's a barrier, there's a challenge, right? And so we want to try to uncover what that might be and how we can help strategize to overcome that. So who are the most important people in your life right now? The reason that we have a lot of supports in our lives. We talk about natural supports at work, but people have natural supports in their lives, right? For better, for worse, some do, some don't. Some are natural supports we don't always think are healthy. Sometimes they are. But the reality is, who do you go back to? Who are the people that are important to you? That offer you that support when you're not at work. Certainly in our role, we can be part of that offsite when people aren't working, but who are other people that are important to them? What kind of help might you need at a job? This might get to some of those accommodations, right? Maybe they'll, think about a prior work experience or volunteer experience, Is there anything that was difficult for you, right? Or is there anything that helped you? Maybe it might lead to an accommodation. It might just lead to something stylistic like, I really like when I have a couple coworkers my own age around that we can just sort of banter and talk, that tells you something about where someone's at and what might be valuable to them. Or someone might say, I like to be left alone. I don't like it when people are breathing, I just want to be left alone at work. That tells you something else about support needs, work environment, work culture, and what services or supports you already have, because people may already have supports in their lives, maybe formal services, maybe just, I talked to my dad and, he helps me process things when I'm having a challenge, right? All right. So let's look at a scenario. I mentioned this probably have just enough time to do this before we part today. So this is called Alex's assessment. And what I want you to do is just think about, as I'm going to read Alex a little bit to you about Alex, then we're going to kind of look at a job description. And I want you to think about, what skills does Alex have? What strategies, supports, or interventions might we need to put in place, if any, to help Alex succeed? But I'll start with Alex's scenario. Alex, a motivated 33-year-old non-traditional college student, has a strong background as a general laborer and warehouse worker, demonstrating a passion for physical work. After being diagnosed with MS and dyslexia, however, Alex has faced challenges in performing certain tasks, but remains enthusiastic about returning to this type of work. As Alex considers a new job opportunity at a local warehouse, it is crucial to identify potential concerns and accommodations that can support success in the role. So Alex, just to remember again, Alex has a passion for physical work, has done warehouse and labor, has been a laborer, has really enjoyed it. Now has a diagnosis of MS, multiple sclerosis, and apparently has dyslexia as well. And so we want to consider some of those things as we look at this job. So what our job match model, or also called discrepancy need, I kind of like calling it job match model because it's about how do we match someone up to a job. Discrepancy analysis just means we look at the discrepancies between the job description and the essential job functions and what the person's skills and abilities and needs are, right? And so, for someone, particularly for someone with significant disabilities to transition to the workforce, it can take some careful consideration and planning to really identify the needed accommodations to support their success. So, and one of the key things that we can do, and this is sort of as we come out of assessment, right? Kind of fast forwarding a little bit, is then we're starting to match this up to jobs in the community. So, let's look at some of the job requirements. So the first job requirement here, let's see, is be able to lift 20-pound bags up to, my annotation skills are terrible, lift 20-pound bags up to 10 times in a 6-hour shift and carry the bags up to 30 feet. We know that Alex can lift 20 pounds, but may have difficulty carrying them for more than 10 feet during a 6-hour shift. So is this a job match? Yes or no? Any thoughts? And I'm sort of asking you to think about, is it a job match based upon what we've learned about Alex? And or what might be some strategies, supports, or interventions that we might put in place, right? Because again, we know that Alex can lift the 20 pounds, but the carrying might be a little challenging. Ah, yes, Pam, add a cart to move bags. Sometimes accommodations don't have to be that complicated. Oh, shoot.
Heather unmuted too. Heather, did you have
Oh,
something?
Heather, go ahead. Yes.
That's exactly what I was going to say, was what Pam said. I was just waiting for you to finish it. It's fine.
No worries. Great minds think alike. Yeah. Well, guess what? Oh, wait. Sorry. So I'm sorry, my animate. Here we go. So as it says here, yes, it is a match with accommodations. The wall might have been, oh no, Alex can't do this, because you have to be able to carry it. What does it say? 10 times in a 6-hour period, you know? So Alex, guess what? There's our accommodation, a rolling cart. You know, simple, not rocket science, but can make such a huge difference. And people don't always think of these things. So let's try the next one. Alex, I'm sorry. The job requires strong communication with the floor supervisor and the team. That's what the job description says. Alex is outgoing and has strong verbal communication skills. So is this a match? I'll tell you what it is. Yes. Yes, it's a match. We don't need any accommodations there, right? Alex is outgoing, has good communication skills. We already know that. There you go. Let's try another one. We know Alex has dyslexia, remember? Follow written instructions for daily assignments. Due to the dyslexia, Alex has difficulty with written instructions. So is this a match, yes or no? And I guess the same question is, if you think off the bat it's not a match, might there be a strategy, support, or intervention you would put in place? Alex has dyslexia, has difficulty with written instructions. Yeah, right, Heather. You know, maybe it's visual with pictures. Maybe it's a different way, you know, because sometimes the employers and human beings get kind of a one path. Well, we always do it this way, right? Instructions are written. Well, we all know that there are more than one way to get to a result. And something as simple as pictures, or let's see, is that what I said here? With accommodations, yes, maybe we explore, here's some options, that recording the instructions, maybe asking a coworker to verbally explain the task, depending on the amount, you know, if this is something that's written down every other day or once a day, you know, having someone just tell someone could be an accommodation, maybe text-to-speech function. Let's try the last one. Stand up and walk, stand and walk up to 4 hours. So we know that Alex can stand for 4 hours. So in that example, it is a match, right? So I love the idea of the discrepancy analysis, because it gets to, it helps us strategize what might seem like an impossible situation. And it is a part of the role of us as employment professionals. So I would be remiss if we didn't at least touch on the concept of transferable skills, which is one of my favorite concepts in our work. You know, many times we work with people that haven't had that beautiful chronological resume with lots of work experiences. If people had that, they wouldn't need us, right? And so we may have to help people ascertain from other aspects of their life. Maybe it's their home chores, their school duties, volunteer work, internships, past work experiences. Maybe it's social clubs or athletics, right? What is it that we can learn about someone. And by the way, I'm just going to add soft skills can also be transferable and marketable to an employer. So let me just try, and this is really where we're going to wrap up today. A couple of examples. Here's a scenario, and I want you to think about what transferable skills might these people have based upon the statement I'm going to share with you. So let's talk about Rolando, who is easygoing with the people around him and seems comfortable with new people. Where might that transfer? What type of work environment? Remember, we're brainstorming. This doesn't mean this is the final job for Rolando. It's demonstrating to Rolando that even if you haven't had work experience, you're outgoing, you're a people person. Guess what? There are employers looking for that. It's building up the esteem, the possibilities, like retail greeter, ticket taker, bellman, right? The customer service, the possibilities are endless. Let's try, I'm going to go to the third one. I know we're right at the hour here. Let's do Gene. Gene has, and this comes up a lot in our work, Gene has a strong attention to detail. Where might this transfer? I've had people say, oh, I work with people on the spectrum. Sometimes they really are thorough and detail oriented. That can be a skill to be marketed. So what do you think?
Data entry.
Oh, data entry. Yeah. Attention to detail. Any others? Medical scribe. Yeah. I've had people say stock person, you know, because if you need things arranged in a certain way and are very precise, right? It's helping people see there are possibilities.
Pharmacy is a place like a pharmacy assistant.
Yeah. The whole point here is, and this is really the last slide, is let's put all this together. We have now a picture of, as we've spent time in assessment, getting to know someone, hopefully in a variety of ways and environments and talking to different people, a rich, robust assessment process. We put the pieces of that puzzle together, and that's the images up here now, is the pieces of that puzzle are put together. We're never going to have all the information. People are funny like that, right? And there's always surprises, but the reality is the more we have, the more successful, the better the job match and the longer term job retention there will be. It improves our relationships with our funding partners, our relationships with job seekers and families, and our relationships with employers, the better assessment that we do. So I'm going to stop there. You've all been wonderful today.
Absolutely.
You will be getting some documents sent to you, some of the things that we've promised. Anything else, Chris, before we close here that we need to say?
No, that's all. Yeah, we'll be sending resources after this was recorded or is recorded. So we'll be uploading it into SharePoint and assigning it to Go1 for those that didn't attend. If your name's just like Best Buddies in a state, send me a message so you get attendance and credit for attending. But thank you, Jeffrey and Aideen, for such valuable content, super applicable to everything we do. If anyone in the field has questions following after, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to kind of pass along the information. We also have office hours in June, and our next all job staff training is in August, our next virtual one. As a lot of you guys know, we're aiming to have a session at Leadership Conference. The invitation went out for that, but our next virtual ones, like I said, the invitation just went out, are for June and August.
And Aideen and our colleague Kim Ismani, you're in good hands. We'll be at Leadership. I can't go. I'm so sorry. I'm going to miss all of you. I have my college reunion. It happens every 5 years. So I will miss all of you, whoever's going to be there. But thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks for your participation.
Bye-bye.
Bye.